All right, I think. All right, I believe everyone's just about made their way into the Sharpening Young Minds, so we'll get started here going through our lesson. If you're visiting with us, again, as everybody's made mention, well, please come back at any opportunity that you can. And we're going to be going through a study here for, I said there's at least 28 or more chapters in that book, so we'll be going through it for a pretty good while, but it's a good study, but we'll be going through church history. Now, what we're going to be talking about through this, if you weren't here last Sunday when we were talking about this, the idea of going from Jerusalem, there in AD around maybe 32, 33, whatever date you may hold in that, and going from that time, the establishment of the church in Acts chapter 2, all the way to when we find ourselves in the church meeting here at Murray City here in 2023. So it's a great study. I enjoy it so much. I hope that it's beneficial to everybody that is going to be in here. Again, give me some feedback. If there's a certain way in which you'd rather me do this, please let me know. Or if you want me to just keep on struggling through this, right? No news is good news, so I'll keep doing what I'm doing. So if you have something you say, we'll do it a little different like this, or maybe dwell a little more on this area. If you have a question, especially if you have an interest in a particular topic as we're going through it, please let me know, and then I'll try to spend a little more time maybe on that as well. We'll kind of rehash a few things that we have talked about already, but we'll get through them as we go through. Now, let's go to Galatians chapter 4 and verse 4, and we're going to read 4 and 5, Galatians chapter 4, verses 4 and 5, as we begin our study here on the history of the church. It says, "But when the fullness of the time was come, God sent forth His Son, made of a woman, made under the law, to redeem them that were under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons." So that's in the fullness of time, and that's what we're going to be looking at this morning, is when all these things came about, right at the exact perfect time in which God would send His Son, Jesus, to be here on the earth. So again, when Jesus died on the cross, that marked a distinct time in history. This was monumental when these things were going on, as we'll get through this. So a center point, right? We kind of base that life on Christ, right? We have BC and AD, and we're looking at those things, and even though they try to change them now, it's still the same time that we base our history around this event that happened during our world. So, it marks the completion of plans that began from before the world did. So again, we go to Ephesians and we understand that before the foundations of the world, right before God even created the world, all these things were going to come about. There wasn't any accident by which this went about. It all continued through just as it was supposed to. So when we begin to look at church history, it's important that we put ourselves back in that time frame. Now, I don't know if we'll touch on it today or not, but there are certain things that will be going on, and we should be able to get into that. And you'll think, well, that sounds a lot like today. Well, the more things change, the more they stay the same. So when we put ourselves back, and it's important when we read the Scriptures, when we read these things, to know what was going on at that time. Who was in power? Who is this letter written to? Right? Why did he write it? So when we gather all these things, we can still apply it to our lives today, but it helps make more sense of what's going on when we have these things going on. Now, this morning, we're going to begin, and we're going to look at Rome. Now, this is a model that's actually over there in Jerusalem, and it's a scaled-down model. Obviously, you can kind of see the people standing right over there to kind of get an idea of how tall this model is. But it's a great thing, and you can get online and check this out. But we have the temple there in the middle. Now, I'm so glad, and I love the way the Bible is just connected in so many different ways. But Brad, Mr. Harold, doing a great job talking about Solomon. But this wasn't Solomon's temple. This wasn't his. This is the one Herod built after the Jews came back. But you have the fortress of Antonia over here, Solomon's porch, where they would preach the first gospel sermon there in Acts 2. So you have all this on the temple ground, that wall there where only the Jews could enter into. So all of these things that were happening at this time. So Rome is in power. But what got Rome in power? So when we're looking at this, again, noticing that this wasn't Solomon's temple, and though this was a great wonder of the ancient world, it did not compare to that of Solomon. So we can go to 2 Kings, and let's go through the Bible a little bit this morning. We've got plenty of time. So let's go through here and we're going to just look. And I love this history. I love going through and looking at this. So we're going to see, we think, well, all right, well the Babylonians destroyed the temple, Solomon's temple at one time, and then we'll find in AD 70 that Rome came in and ultimately destroyed this temple, or what this model is representing. So when we go to 2 Kings chapter 24 and verse 13, talking about King Nebuchadnezzar here, and he carried out thence all the treasures of the house of the Lord, and the treasures of the king's house, and cut in pieces all the vessels of gold, which Solomon, king of Israel, had made in the temple of the Lord, as the Lord had said. So again, if you're here on Sunday mornings, going through that about how Solomon had been building the temple, he's dedicated the temple. We're getting into that this morning. We looked at how the ark was moved into the temple, but we find there that the children of Israel were going away from God. They're pulling away from God. Now, what does that have to do with Rome being in power at this time? So let's go over to Daniel chapter 2. Daniel chapter 2. So we get the end of Chronicles there, and that depicting all that. Now we're going to go to Daniel. Daniel chapter 2. All right, Daniel 2. Let's begin to look in verse 32. Now, this is a passage of Scripture that's very familiar to many of us. Daniel chapter 2, verse 32. King Nebuchadnezzar, he's going to have this vision, right? And he sees this colossal image and the way it's made, and he's worried about it, and he doesn't know what's going on. So let's look in verse 32 and see what Daniel's saying. So this image's head was of fine gold, his breast and his arms of silver, his belly and his thighs of brass, his legs of iron, his feet part of iron and part of clay. Thou sawest till that a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon his feet, and that were of iron and clay, and brake them in pieces. Now that's important as we continue through here. There's 4 different images in this, or different material in this colossal image. There's brass, or gold, excuse me. There's silver, brass, and iron, and in the feet of iron and clay. So what does that mean to me today, though? Still, all right, stay with me. Now we think, well, what does this mean? And if you're not careful, you'll do like what we were talking about this morning, and you'll eisegete too much into that. People will try to put that and say, well, these are nations of the world today, right? It's China, it's Russia, it's all these things. No, let's not get carried away with that. Because when you look at verse 38, right, the Bible's a good commentary for itself, is it not? And wheresoever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field and the fowls of the heaven shall have he given unto thine hand, and have made thee ruler over them all. Now Daniel talking to Nebuchadnezzar, thou art this head of gold. So that dates it right there. This image that Daniel has seen, a head of gold, and then the chest being of silver, of brass, of iron, you say, all right, it has to start with Babylon. Now, as we continue through that, let's look too in Daniel chapter 7 and see if we can make this make a little bit more sense. Daniel chapter 7. You think, well, all right. So again, we're getting to Rome, because Rome is that 4th kingdom, that iron and stone mixed. Now, it's important because we again talk about the establishment of the church, and that church being that rock, right, that was not made with hands, that fell and it crumbled all these other kingdoms. Now, Babylon was a mighty power at that time. So now let's look in Daniel chapter 7. Let's begin in verse 3. Now, Daniel here is speaking. Now, again, let's make a note and time it here in verse 1. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream. So this is when he has the dream. In verse 4, the first was like a lion, and had eagle's wings, and I beheld till the wings thereof were plucked, and it was lifted up from the earth, and made stand upon the feet as a man, and a man's heart was given to it. And behold, another beast, a second like a bear. It raised up itself on one side, and it had 3 ribs in the mouth of it, between the teeth of it. And they said thus unto it, arise, devour much flesh. After this I beheld, and lo, another like a leopard, which had upon the back of it 4 wings as a fowl. The beast had also 4 heads, and a dominion was given to it. Now, verse 7. And after this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible and strong exceedingly, and it had great iron teeth. It devoured and brake in pieces, and stamped the residue with the feet of it, and it was diverse from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. Now, hopefully we will have time to get into the prophecies and stuff of Daniel and things like that. But what we're going to look at, and again, if you're not careful, you'll read these passages. So we have a lion. We have a beast that looks like a lion, a beast that looks like a bear, a beast that looks like a leopard, and then a fourth beast that was diverse, that was different than all the other ones. So that first one is Babylon. And the second one is going to be Medo-Persia, and then the third will be Greece, and then the fourth being Rome. The same prophecy as the colossal image, and at this time, right, is that fourth beast, and that's what we're talking about here today. Now, let's flip over to Daniel chapter 5. Let's look at verse 28 real quick. Daniel chapter 5 and verse 28. When we're talking about that, let's say, all right, so the beast is the lion is Babylon. We talked about that through the colossal image. It's got to go Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and then Rome. Now, when you look at secular history, that's the way it played out. All of these nations went like that. Now, when you get in the context there in the Daniel chapter 5, looking there about Belshazzar, he's going to be making this feast. Now, look in verse 24, and we'll get some context there. It says, "Then was the part of the hand sent from him, this writing was written." So we remember, Belshazzar sees the hand writing on the wall. He writes in verse 25, "And this is the writing that was written, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin." This is the interpretation of the thing. Mene, God has numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances and art found wanting. Now look at Paris. So that phrase there, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. All right. We know the image of gold was Babylon. We know that the second image is Medo-Persia because we find that Belshazzar is a Babylonian king. And then we find there in verse 31, well, look at verse 30. "In that night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, or Babylonians, slain, and Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old." So, the Medes came in. Now, that Medo-Persian, those two empires are going to be one. So that's why when we look at that beast, it's raised up on one side. This beast is raised up because it's a Medo and Persia, and that's a great study when you get back into Cyrus. But he's going to be a combination of those two nations. But one's going to raise up and be stronger than the other. We'll find that in Persia. But the Medes and the Persians. Now, one more, and then we'll get into some more of this. Daniel chapter 8, verses 3 and 8. All right, so they say, all right, I know the first image is Babylon. I know the second image is Medo-Persia. But what about the third and the fourth? Now, let's go to that Daniel chapter 8. And look there in beginning in verse 3. "Then I lifted up mine eyes and saw, and behold, there stood before the river a ram which had 2 horns. Now, again, Medo-Persia, the 2 horns. And the 2 horns were high. But the one was higher than the other. The higher came up last." So again, Medo-Persia, the bear is lifted up on one side. It says the horns of this goat, or this ram, is lifted up on one side. So the one coming into power, Persia, having that power. "I saw the ram pushing westward." So let's go back, if you can think of your mind, the area there in the Babylonian, they're going west, right? Going towards Spain, going towards Rome. All right? It says, I'm a place here. Pushing westward and northward and southward, so that no beast might stand before him, neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand, but he did according to his will and became great. So, Medo-Persia, they're conquering the known world. But look, and as I was considering, behold, a he-goat came from the west, from Greece, and on the face of the whole earth, and touched not the ground. That means he was going so swiftly. Go back and read some historical evidence about Alexander the Great. He moved and conquered the world at a rapid pace. They said he's not even touching the ground, and the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. That's Alexander the Great. He's coming from the west, right, from Greece, and he's conquering that world. Now notice, and he came to the ram that had the 2 horns, which had been seen standing before the river, and ran unto him with the fury of his power. And I saw him come close unto the ram, and he was moved with choler against him, and smote the ram, and brake his 2 horns, and there was no power in the ram to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground, and stamped upon him, and there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand. And you think, well, that's great, man, but how do you know that's Greece? We've looked at Babylon. We've looked at Medo-Persia. How do you know that's Greek? Let's go to verse 20. Again, the Bible's its best commentary. Daniel chapter 8 and verse 20. "The ram which thou sawest having 2 horns are the kings of Media and Persia." Now let's continue reading. "And the rough goat is the king of Grecia. the great horn that was between his eyes is the first kingdom. So there we have it. It's not Russia, it's not China, it's nothing like that. But when we're talking about this, and the reason I wanted to dwell on this, is that this is exactly how God commanded it to do. Now we have these empires, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece. All these people are contributing things to this time that we have. And now, finally, the fourth beast, we have the Roman Empire. Now, that's important because when you look at Daniel chapter 2, that it's going to be at that time that this rock is going to come down and destroy these kingdoms. Now, what was that rock? It's the church, the kingdom of God, right? The kingdom of Christ is going to come down and destroy these things. So we have Rome being in this time. Again, all of that I can't say it. I can have it in my head, but I can't say it. Anyway, all that coming down to this point in time where we say, all right, here it is, right? The fullness of time, right when God wanted Jesus to be here, is it. All of these things were going to come about. All of these things help in certain ways to prepare for Christ. So, let's look this morning at the Roman government. Again, getting into that. That's a great study, and I probably went way off on that a little far too much than what I needed to, but it's a great study to find us here at Rome. That's why we're here at Rome having this power. Now, Rome was in control in Palestine. We might remember that map that we had, and they made sure that they knew, everybody in the provinces knew that they had. Now, you think about an empire the size of the Roman Empire, you'd have to make sure that you were enforcing a lot of things. That way you didn't lose control and have these nations rising up against you. So, by doing that, they had a large military presence that was available. Now again, think about that with the crucifixion of Jesus, that the Roman soldiers were doing this. They were carrying out the activities of the crucifixion, that the Jews didn't have the authority to capital punishment. They could stone an individual, but to have him crucified, they had to deliver him before Pilate, and that's why we have them doing that. We see through Acts that they would just go out and stone those individuals, again, breaking that law. They didn't have the right to do that, but they have to deliver him over to Rome, because Rome's the power. That's why he's held in front of Pilate. Right? That's all leading up to that. The Roman power, the Roman soldiers were the one that carried out this punishment. Rome came up, they didn't come up with the crucifixion. I think actually Persia came up with it, but Rome kind of perfected it, if you'll allow me to say that. So now we have this great military presence. We're Rome, and we're here, and you better bow down before us. Now, also, to keep people in check, they had a large presence of tax collectors. Now, let's look at that for just a moment. Let's go to Luke chapter 19. We don't have the time to go through all of that. But Luke 19, and understanding that there's many a tax collector that will be in this area, because you're like, yeah, I can remember some of these things. In Luke chapter 19, you find there about Zacchaeus and how he was a chief among the publicans. In Luke chapter 19, he passing through Jericho, like verse 2, behold, there was a man named Zacchaeus, which was the chief among the publicans, and he was rich. Now that's important, right? Because we see these individuals talked about at this time, and think, why was he rich? It's because he took more than what he was supposed to. Again, remind yourself that this was a time of uneducated people. They were tradesmen maybe, or farmers. There weren't really a lot of people and they didn't have the laws written out. The tax collector came and said, this is what you owe me, right? Pay up. Well, they didn't really have any way that they could argue about that. So, unfortunately, many tax collectors were doing these things, and they were robbing people. So, Zacchaeus, he's very rich, because this is the kind of man that he was. Of course, we don't have time to go through Zacchaeus, but we'll find out that he was going to give back all that, right? And he turned and followed Jesus. So, good for Zacchaeus. Now, let's go and to say, well, let's clarify that a little bit. Let's go to Luke chapter 3 and look there in verse 12. Luke chapter 3, looking there in verse 12. Luke 3. It says, then came also publicans to be baptized, and said unto him, Master, what shall we do? Look at verse 13 of Luke chapter 3. And he said unto them, exact no more than that which is appointed you. So that's what the publicans were doing. And that's why they were despised. One, because they were Jews, and here they are in their native land, and Rome is taxing them to death. And you have fellow Jews that are coming up and saying, yeah, we need to give them more taxes and give me more taxes. So these were their countrymen. So this is why the publicans were so despised, because of the Roman rule. But let's notice one more here in Matthew chapter 9. Matthew chapter 9, and looking there in verse 9, we find Jesus walking back, choosing his disciples. In Matthew chapter 9 and verse 9, it says, "And Jesus passed forth from thence. He saw a man named Matthew sitting at the receipt of customs. And he said unto him, Follow me. And he arose and followed him." So Matthew was a tax collector. But it was pointed out to me, and I say that's probably accurate, that he was an honest tax collector because he was sitting at the table trying to get, doing it right, if you will. That oftentimes they would have men hired to do these activities and say, all right, you collect the tax, I'll give you a cut, I'll take a cut, we'll give Rome a cut, everybody will be happy. But Matthew's there, he's, as they said, an honest tax collector. We find him there. So, Rome, they got a heavy military presence, they got a heavy taxing on the people, and they want to make sure their presence is felt. But through these things, this helped spread the gospel. We may not think about that, but it really did. So at the end of a bloody civil war, Augustus, we find Augustus, you may want to call him the first Caesar. Some people want to call Julius Caesar the first Caesar. It depends on how you want to look at it. Augustus was the first one that had all the rule over everything like that. It was still a little divided with Caesar, Julius Caesar. But he defeats Mark Antony. And you may also have heard him called Octavian. So Octavian, Augustus, same emperor. He defeats Mark Antony. Mark Antony and Cleopatra in the Battle of Actium. They're in 31 BC. So they're defeated. Now Augustus is the ruler. He's the emperor. So through this empire, this great stretch of the known world, right? All these kingdoms falling down through the line. Now we have Rome. And it says there's peace because Romans rule, right? They're ironing it. Remember what the prophecies were saying, that it was going to be a diverse beast and it was going to be exceedingly strong and violent, right? That's what Rome was. That's when the crucifixions, they didn't, I know sometimes we picture the cross being way up on the hill far away. We kind of sing that song about that, and I guess in some ways it was far away, but a lot of times Golgotha, that hill right there, was as you went into the city, and they would hang those criminals there because they wanted you to see when you went in, right? I'm a Jew, and I'm going in here and I hate Rome, but I'm not going to say anything because I see my brothers hanging on that cross, right, sometimes for days, and that was to get Rome. They said, you're going to do what we tell you to do, we're going to do it by force. So as they go into the city, they see these criminals being hung, so they're doing it very forcefully. They're taxing them to death and everything, so there's a lot of peace. I guess because you don't really have a lot of time to do anything else. So there's a universal law throughout the area. They get that from the law of the Medes and Persians. You can go to Daniel chapter 6 and verse 8 and also Esther chapter 8 and verse 8, looking at that and saying, all right, that law, they couldn't be revoked. Once they make the law, you have to make amendments to that. So they adopted that from the Medo-Persians. Again, they had a standard coinage, right? The treasury was a standard way in which they were to do things. The roads, they made roads because Rome said that they're going to have a rebellion way down here in Mesopotamia. I've got to get there from Rome, so they made roads where they could get their armies there quickly, but this helped spread the gospel. Now, from that though, unfortunately, because of the high corruption, because of this, the prosperity, it brought a lot of corruption into the land. So, they had a system of slavery. We'll get into some of that, right? That you could be taken slave or made slaves by many different ways in that time. That this was kind of the social order, and many people fell in this. So you have the hierarchy of the Roman rulers. Again, you have the emperor, he's on the very top. You have senators, you have knights, you have citizens. Because remember what Paul was talking about when we flip back to that passage when the soldiers come out of the fortress Antonia because of the riot. And he's about to beat him. You know what, Paul, he said, can you beat a Roman citizen without a trial? Because the citizens had that right? Providentials and freeborn, right? That's what Paul says that. He said, with a great sum I paid to be a Roman citizen. Paul says, I was freeborn. So everybody backed off of him then. That's why. Because of the ruling system, if you're a Roman citizen, and I love that about Paul. I mean, God chose the right man for the job, did he not? Because Paul was a Roman citizen, right? He was a Pharisee. He was ruled and schooled in all these things. But freeborn takes over that. So then finally you have enslaved people and beggars. And we find that, again, recorded all throughout the New Testament. We have these individuals. So we're going to wrap up here just a minute with this, and then we'll have to pick up again. There's so much in here, so just please bear with me when we go through it. But to be a slave, to be a servant, right, when we're looking at these things, your homeland might be conquered. So again, Rome is ever expanding their territory. They've got to have resources. They've got to have these things. They're expanding their territory. You conquer you become a slave. Children that were lost, maybe their parents dying in these things, they were sold into slavery. And then if you could not pay your debt, you were sold into slavery. So from that, the Bible speaks quite a bit about that. You go to the book of Philemon. What was Philemon about? That Paul is writing to Philemon because Onesimus, his runaway slave, right? He ran away and he's trying to get Philemon, that even though Onesimus ran away, he's now a Christian. And he disobeyed him by running away, but he wants him to bring him back in and accept him as a brother. So that's why that's important, and we look, and that's what's going on at this time. Onesimus was a slave, he ran away. Then in Ephesians chapter 6, 5 through 9, we see what servants are supposed to be doing, that if I am a slave, a servant, I'm to be working, not to just please my master, but to please the Lord if I'm a Christian and a servant. And then as masters, even if you own individuals, they're trying to work off a debt for you. You are to be kind to them because we have a master as well that's watching us. So we're going to stop right there. I know I didn't get very far, and I apologize for that. I'll try to do a little bit better next Sunday and try to go a little more quickly. But it's so great. And when you understand so much of this, it really helps understand the Bible when we read these passages. I know several of us have talked about that. Sometimes you read stuff and you don't ever think anything of it, and then you hear something else and it just makes a lot more sense. So I enjoyed that very much. All right.